Welcome to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rogers, VP of Business Development at KeyTech. Each month, me and a KeyTecher are going to interview a MedTech leader and talk to them about the critical data-driven decisions they make in their programs. All right, welcome everybody to the next episode of MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Today's guest, Dave Saunders, CTO of Galen Robotics, a local Baltimore company. Dave, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks. It's great to be here.
Yeah, I mean, you're stirring up a lot of excitement over there in the Carroll Canton area with your startup company, and you've been in Baltimore for a few years now. Yeah, got a lot to cover here in this episode. Very excited about it. Usually, we're interviewing maybe CEOs or folks that are kind of trying to run the company, and I'm hoping to get into a little bit more of the weeds with you today. Not too much, of course, but. Okay. My first question for you related to Galen Robotics is, so what drew you to the company six years ago?
My co-founder and I, Bruce LaCorwick, we had actually done another medtech company together. I actually have known his family and worked with his brother back in 1990 at a very early internet startup. So I've taken a lot of products to market. I've done a lot of startups. And in 2016, we were approached by the head of Johns Hopkins Technology Ventures, actually at the big MedTech JP Morgan conference in San Francisco. And he said, we've got we've got this new robotic technology. We're looking for somebody to commercialize it. It was developed by Russell Taylor, and I knew who he was. He's basically, if you've got baseball cards of like who's who in robotics, it all starts with Russ. And so I was, that right there got my interest. And so we came out to Johns Hopkins and we took a look at everything and kicked the tires for a few months and licensed the technology and began in San Jose working out of our homes. And we came out here about 1 week out of every month and just began to develop the technology. But it was just, what was really interesting to me was there are a lot of surgical robots in the marketplace. Like in spine alone, there are 7 surgical robots just for doing pedicle screws in spine. So there's actually a lot more surgical robots out there than a lot of people realize. But in spite of how many there are huge, huge areas of unmet need where surgeons were literally coming to the university side of Johns Hopkins saying, where are our tools? Why don't we have the cool technology? Right. And so this robot really checked a lot of incredibly important boxes for what was needed in the industry, and it just seemed like something that could make a lot of impact for a variety of reasons. So I was really stoked, and so yeah, we started the company in 2016, and then right before COVID, we had actually come to an agreement with the state of Maryland. And we moved the company headquarters to Baltimore, and now I'm here.
No, that's great. It's always good to hear the screaming from the mountaintops from your customers, right?
That's right.
Yeah. So as I understand, your prototype, it's very much a collaborative robot, and we'll talk a little bit more towards the end about the future of robotics. But I want to make it clear to our audience that this is very much a tool that's collaborating with the human. It's a machine collaborating with the human. So why don't you just describe to our audience real quick, the makeup of the product, kind of how the user interacts with it, and how it's used in microsurgery.
Sure. When you look at surgical robotics, just to kind of like lay the groundwork, you've got kind of a continuum of types of robots. And on one far side, you've got things like the robot that does LASIK surgery, to improve your vision. You set it up, you push a button, and then the ophthalmologist goes and drinks an espresso or something like that while it's doing its thing. It's fully autonomous, it's navigated, it runs by itself once you've set it up. And there are other robots that do similar kinds of things for knees and hips, and usually bony robots are autonomous. And then you've got a category of robots like the Da Vinci, the famous one, right? And it's you could describe it as a collaborative robot, but people are more likely to recognize it as a remote controlled robot. So you put your hands in this little special controls and you actually move laparoscopic rods around, but it is 100% guided by the surgeon in real time. It has some additional abilities that are under development that will do little things on its own here and there in a very collaborative kind of back and forth way. But for the most part, it's a passive robot that is basically just extending the hands of the surgeon. For what we're doing, we had a challenge where there are a lot of procedures, especially up in the head and neck, where a robot that's been optimized for laparoscopic surgery is just not the right solution. It just won't fit into those kinds of environments. And so the surgeons needed something that really didn't mind. It's not like they were looking for a new way to do surgery, but what they needed was either a third hand or some way to really stabilize the instruments that they were using and support the surgeries as they were being done. So what our robot is optimized for is basically taking a surgeon's instrument that they would already be using, holding on to it, and then just like power steering, when you're in a car and you turn the steering wheel, there's a sensor that actually then ultimately, feeds into a linkage mechanism and turns your tires, right? You feel like you're in control, but there's actually a mechanical assist that's doing all of the heavy lifting, so to speak. Well, in this case, the robot is technically moving the instrument, even though you're holding onto it where you would normally hold onto it. But the result of that is the instrument is now extremely stable, and you can even do things like there's like a pedal on the floor that engages the robot to allow it to follow your hand. If you let go of the pedal, you can actually let go of the instrument. Can't do that normally. Like if you've got an instrument down like in somebody's middle ear or a biopsy needle in somebody's brain or whatever, you can't normally let go of those and have them be held steady, rock solid steady. But now you have this ability. So not only do you get assistance while you're moving the instruments around, but you also have these new capabilities for kind of like a third hand that can ergonomically fit into surgical environments that are very, very challenging just because they're really tight. You know, just give you one example, then we'll move on, is imagine there's transsphenoidal procedure where they're going up your nostril to basically do different kinds of brain surgeries, typically like to remove the pituitary gland. Sometimes, because of the requirements of the procedure, you'll have between 2 and 4 surgeons all cramming their instruments plus an endoscope up into your 2 nostrils. It's it's horrible, right? Only so many people can lean into the table and reach across like that. And so those are the environments where you really need better technology, better tools to assist the surgeons for what they know how to do. They just need that kind of leg up technology wise. So that's where our robot is going after.
Got it. Yeah. So to speed things up a little bit, I'll also
Sorry.
highlight a few things. No, that was great. A great background. But a couple other elements. Number one that I picked up, that you don't have a disposable, like you're designing your platform to accommodate off the shelf surgical tools, which I think is pretty unique. Or maybe that's changed. But the second thing
There is a
also,
disposable in that there's a disposable that is the
adapter.
instrument adapter. Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah.
fair. That's right. But yeah, the tools themselves, you're partnering with on market products. That's pretty
Yep.
a great way to speed yourself to market. And then the other, I think, clever part of your business that I've read about and people can read of it up on it offline is that you're going after the subscription model versus the capital expense. So it allows you to get in the door easier. But one area that I thought was interesting, worth talking about at a high level about your company is that there isn't one particular sliver of the surgical market that your robot would justify the expense, but there's multiple areas in like soft tissue surgery, and the combination of all of them makes your business viable. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the big, I think, Achilles heels of robots in this industry is so many of them are optimized for an individual procedure. So, if you want to do a total knee replacement, there are robots out there for it. But that robot can't be moved to another department. It's not going to do LASIK. It's not going to do pedicle screws. It's not going to do prostatectomies and things like that. And so you end up with a lot of these one-trick ponies out there that have $1 million plus price tags, but very narrow utility.
Hmm.
And that's a huge problem in this industry because I'll tell you, I've talked to a lot of hospital administrators who refer to those things as just giant fancy dust collectors. And so with our platform, by simply changing the instrument that it's holding, we can potentially move into multiple departments and provide real value to the surgeon. And all that changes is what instrument we're holding. And there are a lot of opportunities that way. So it's a great opportunity for us. Yeah.
I've done my homework. I know your favorite book was Crossing the Chasm. So here we go. We are going to cross the chasm. I have not read it myself, but the podcast is called Speed to Data here. So I want to cover what data was most critical as you were crossing the chasm. And granted, we're always in the chasm, so to speak, in the world we're in. But we'll start with right when you started the company, because our audience, is clearly the startup world where they maybe are licensing technology like you
Yeah.
did, or even like a global company that sees promise and there's a prototype, benchtop prototype that shows feasibility. So there's the early stage, and then there's the stage where you're kind of in now, like core hardcore product development, classic product development. What data was most critical for you once you got more funding, and then here towards the end and in the future more commonly, what data is and how's that data going to be leveraged? So let's start day or maybe month 6 after stop doing the other work that you're doing maybe, and you're all in on Galen. What what data was most critical for you as the CTO and kind of as a company to really show that this product had viability? I mean, obviously the surgeons were saying, "Hey, we want the product," and Hopkins was happy to license it to you. But what were you focused on?
Well, it is interesting in a regulated industry like this that it's very difficult to uh, obviously do anything that smells like pre-marketing. But quite honestly, you need to identify a clinical application that has value to the surgeon. And by value to the surgeon, I mean that they're actually going to go to bat to get that paid for. Um, and this is true of any industry. I've taken over 40 products to market, and in every single case, the most important thing has always been, what does the end user actually want to do? Something that I know drives engineers just bananas is when product managers just hand off like a laundry list of features with no context, no, just tell me what they're trying to do. And that is certainly qualitative data, but it's really important. And so, especially for us in medical robotics, we had to go into surgeries. We had to see what the surgeons were doing so that we could in real time have them tell us, see how much of a pain this is. Look at what I'm doing right here. Look at the ergonomics of what I'm trying to do here. And this is why this is so difficult today, right? And this is why it's so difficult for this surgery to be done at a secondary hospital because I have the facilities and I'm, one of the few people that have the magic hands to get through this. And yet every other surgeon that maybe can't qualify to do the procedure, they know all of it. They're certainly trained well enough to know how to do it, but it's just a little bit of a reach from a dexterity or an ergonomic standpoint. And so we really had to get that under our skin and understand that. On the other side of the same coin, I suppose, is we had to then understand how that translated into kind of mechanical numbers. You take a look at something like, and I'm not trashing on the Da Vinci in any possible way here, it's a fantastic system for what it does, but it is optimized for the kinds of motions required in laparoscopic surgery, right? When I'm doing when I'm supporting a procedure, exploratory, of course, because we're pre-FDA, but when we're looking at a procedure, say for the middle ear, I'm looking at zones that are less than a millimeter when I'm trying to like go through like a mastoidectomy. I've got like sometimes a millimeter of clearance that is going to be either a successful operation or patient or irreparable patient injury in the case of middle ear surgery, right? For prostatectomy, nerve sparing technique, for doing a colon resection, you've got a little bit more give, right? And so the guys engineering something like a laparoscopic robot, they don't have the requirement to like have like 50 microns of precision motion for their minimal increments of moving the end effectors. We do, right? It would be over engineering for a laparoscopic robot to dial in their hardware to the kind of precision that we're doing because it's unnecessary for laparoscopic procedures. So understanding what your scale is and understanding what you need to do, not only from a range standpoint, like what are my potential procedures that I could be doing, or what are the kinds of things that this platform could be doing in the future, and can I reach into those with what I'm making now, but also having a perspective on where your current scale of motion, all of those things relate to, heck, what kind of screws are you going to choose?
Right.
What kind of metal are you going to choose for the chassis to provide enough stiffness? All of those things will come down to having that initial understanding of what kind of scale am I really trying to achieve here. And that's critical because you could really end up either over engineering or under engineering a product and just missing the boat for your domain of surgeries or procedures or whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, I think translating market needs into product requirements. I mean, you just nailed it, and I totally agree. You don't want to over or under engineer your product. So my next corollary question here is what steps did you take to evaluate a university prototype, um, to evaluate whether that prototype could actually meet some of these requirements?
Well, fortunately, a lot of legwork had been done for us. But I'll tell you, one of the most interesting things. I don't have a prop here; it'd probably take me too long to get it. But one of the interesting things that happened during the early days of the development for this technology was another grad student had actually done kind of a joking YouTube video where she was actually playing the old Mattel operation game with the Da Vinci that they have at Johns Hopkins. And it's pretty funny to watch, right? You got this giant $2 million robot, and you're plucking out, the funny bone from the little kid's toy, right? And Russ Taylor looked at that and he said, "Well, that's interesting, but those pieces are gigantic compared to the kinds of anatomy you'd be going after with this robot. You'd be looking at, say, for example, you're sometimes doing like one potential procedure is for laryngeal, removing like a cyst from your vocal cords. You're doing that with a 25 centimeter long instrument, and you're trying to grasp on tissue by bringing it down into the person's mouth and grabbing on this 1 millimeter, maybe 1.5 millimeter polyp. That's enough to really mess up your voice. And you're trying to grab on that, make an incision, all that sort of thing. So, how can you support those hand motions to make that more precise? And so instead of the Monopoly game, what they ended up developing was this little piece of sheet metal with a spiral that was a millimeter. The channel in the spiral was a millimeter gap, and the game basically was to take a laryngeal instrument, which is about 25 centimeters long, and you put the tip into the channel, and you had to run it through the channel without ever touching the sides. Now, that is very analogous to the kinds of hand motions that you would do in these narrow corridor procedures that you're doing of upper head and neck. And so just being able to do that was actually a really big deal. In fact, there was a study that ended up getting published showing just great results just by being able to do that. And we ended up taking our first commercial prototype of the robot to a otolaryngology educational conference, and we had over 70 ENT surgeon department heads come into a by invitation only demo, and we actually had them play the game. And we had people, their jaws are on the floor. They're like, holy cow. We only had one person that could actually beat the robot freehand, and they couldn't do it repeatedly. So they had one good shot, right? They did one good thing. But that was great because what that really helped us be able to see was that even the less nerdy people in the company could go, look at where we're helping surgeons do. That was something that we could really point at. And then by using, camera vision and things like that, we were able to actually measure motion of the tool inside the spiral, and that's how we were able to then eventually quantify how much we were stabilizing the instrument. But just being able to, as funny as it sounds, being able to build the equivalent of a kid's game and actually use that as a mechanism for validating the function of the tool with surgeons, it just clicked. It just, every one of the surgeons was like, holy cow, this, not only will this make my life easier, this will make it easier for me to train residents because they'll spend less time focusing on all of the annoying techniques for mitigating hand tremor and blah, 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 blah. And they're going to focus on clinical effectiveness. How do I do this surgery correctly, right? And so it was huge for us to be able to make that connection. We still do it.
Yeah, it's such a great story that I mean, it's not rocket science here. To the extent you can use the benchtop prototype that you inherit, or even mock up yourself, and and have your end users use that. And there's either published data, or if you can use computer vision, as you said, to show technically that you're going to meet a few of those key requirements, then you have that data and you're ready to talk to investors and say there's a market need, you have some technical feasibility here, you're ready to form a real company and actually proceed with product development, which leads me deep into the chasm now. Now that we're in it, you've been doing it for a few years, and if I may, ask the question again. So our audience is developing these medical devices just like you are. What data has, maybe to phrase it, what data has been the hardest to capture, or most critical for you to get through the woods in product development?
Well, let me give you another example, just a quick story. So we took the benchtop version that Johns Hopkins had developed, and we tried to turn into kind of like the first prettier looking prototype. And I think you actually saw that. And so the main guts of this technology is a Delta parallel robot, and the original version is actually relatively small. And so to get it into the surgical field, another student at the school, as one of their own, I think it was a master's project, they'd actually built this mobile base that would actually hold the Delta robot and move it into position. So we took what we knew. We took what had already been done, and we just we made it a little bit bigger, and we made it look a little prettier, and we took it to this conference. Ergonomically, it was completely unusable. And the reason for that is, and we'd completely forgotten about this, otolaryngologists, so, rhinologists, laryngologists, otologists, they're using surgical microscopes that are like right here. And the robot is supposed to then also come into basically the same area, and it's supposed to ergonomically fit into the environment that you already have. Well, that Delta, which we ended up calling the flying trash can, was banging into the microscope. We'd completely forgotten about this critical environment that was in the OR. We're like, well, is it taking up too much floor space? I mean, we had all these KPIs that were important, but we'd completely forgotten about the airspace being occupied by the meat and potatoes of the robot. And so, this really goes back to, yeah, I mean, we, I'm not sure that that really was going to end up being the final prototype anyway. But it was a bit of a, oh gosh, what are we going to do now? And you need those kind of failures. Honestly, I get nervous talking to potential users and potential customers and things like that, and not having at least somebody tell me that I'm an idiot and dude, this is not going to work, and you're a moron, and this is why, right? If I can't find somebody like that, I start getting fidgety because I'm like, I don't like it when people just like they're either being polite and just like going, oh yeah, that'll be beautiful. I'd love to see your robot. You got to find somebody that goes, you screwed this up, dude, and here's why. And so even though it was a little discouraging, we pivoted really fast and we came up with a newer design that actually meets more needs than the original intention anyway. So it was a great discovery. But you need to have some failures. You gotta, if you're not getting some kind of negative feedback, and I mean somebody actually like getting in your face and giving you four-letter words telling you how badly you screwed up with your prototype. If you can't find at least one person that does that, you're probably not even trying hard enough with what you're developing in the first place. And just keep
Yeah,
digging.
no, no. So can you give us and our audience an idea for like how frequently you would poll, market leaders for this kind of feedback? It's just like quarterly, you would kind of try to get in front of stakeholders and go out beyond Hopkins. Like at what clip were you getting this content?
Constantly. Bruce and I are doing at least one really in-depth demo with a KOL each month. That's a minimum. In the beginning, it was probably at least once a week, and in some cases we were getting, well, the first year Bruce and I were on a plane all the time, so we were in every major hospital showing them, look, this is the technology we're developing, and we're trying to figure out, are we going in the right place, and what how would this solve your problems. We were getting in front of as many people as possible and just showing them technology, right? Because we didn't, at that point, I didn't even have a rollout strategy for a product. It was really still raw technology, but we were validating it constantly, just making sure that we're going in the right direction. Is this going to solve your problem?
So we hear you loud and clear. You want rapid and constant customer feedback, and you want people to tell you you're doing the wrong things.
If you have to build a prototype with paper mache, do it. Don't wait for all the fancy actuators and for the motors to come in from wherever you're sourcing them from and all that kind of stuff. Do whatever it takes. And in fact, there literally were paper mache mock-ups done before the original Mark Zero was produced at Johns Hopkins. So I'm not even kidding when I say paper mache. Whatever it takes, get a mock-up made and get feedback.
So you're on your way to market, and if I recall, it's de novo, right? So, and then talk a little bit about um, using on the market tools with your consumable. What does that look like?
That was a big deal. We've got enough challenges with the technology that we're building. We didn't want to become instrument manufacturers. They're Teleflex and Tegra. There's plenty of folks out there that make perfectly fine, jackal graspers and scissors and cup forceps and all those kind of stuff. Who wants to go into that business, right? And so what was really important was that we could meet the surgeons where they are with the instruments that they already know how to use. And so that was, to me, that's a huge, for at least for us, it ends up being a huge piece of the puzzle in terms of customer adoption and customer acceptance, because we're not asking them to do a procedure differently. We're not even asking them necessarily to use a different instrument. Because of FDA regulatory, we have to specify exactly what instrument we're holding, like down to the part number. So right now, I'm only going to be supporting one brand of instrument, but over time, we could be supporting, any arbitrary number of instruments, and it's a serial process over time. But that's a huge for us because it means that we don't have to spend a lot of we don't have to burn a lot of calories trying to figure out how to reinvent the instrument that's already out there. They're class one instruments. They're already cleared. It's great. And so by supporting them and by giving them more capability, My favorite analogy is always, chocolate stands on its own, peanut butter stands on its own. You put them together, and it's my favorite candy. And to me, this technology is that kind of peanut butter cup solution because we're taking two standalone technologies and we're bringing them together and creating a new solution that does not exist on its own. And I think that's great. If you can do something like that, I think that's a huge win.
Let's talk a little bit more about testing with the users. I mean, so there's this hybrid between market research and, paper mache and, kind of like more formal formative evaluations. And so I noticed that your product has a GUI, a separate screen. Can you talk a little bit about how the surgeon interacts with the screen, how you determined kind of what goes on the screen? And I assume that it's different for each procedure.
Yeah, we obviously, the name of the game is to keep your user interface not looking like DOS or Windows 3.1, so you don't just like cram every icon onto the screen that you possibly can. So it needed to be very, very clean. It's a touch screen interface and it's as adaptive as it possibly can be. So if you're doing a laryngeal procedure, you're only going to be presented with laryngeal instruments. And then eventually, as we add other surgical disciplines by adding other instruments that are used in those other disciplines, you would log in and say, I'm doing neurosurgery, and here's my selection of supported neurosurgery instruments. And so that keeps the clutter down significantly. When you're actually doing a procedure or testing the robot or doing a trial or whatever, um, we try again, we want to keep the information that's on the screen usable and actionable, but not like just, a ton of telemetry and numbers, zipping along like the Matrix, but have things be very, very simple and easy to see. So when you're moving the robot around, we'll show you where the instrument is within the surgical workflow. For the most part, you probably don't even need that information, but sometimes if the robot is draped, you might not know that you're at the edge of your workspace, that sort of thing. So it can occasionally be useful to like look over at the screen and go, oh, I'm over, but maybe I need to shift my robot 6 inches to the left or something like that because I'm in a weird space ergonomically. So we've got that kind of feedback, but we just want to keep it as clean as possible, um, and just avoid. How do I usually put this? I think one of the frustrations from a lot of surgeons is that a lot of surgical robots kind of become the centerpiece of the OR instead of the surgeon. And so we want to be a piece of equipment that's there to serve the surgeon, not turn it into the surgeon is there to serve the robot. You know what I mean? And so it's all about what can we provide that is easy to digest and is not distracting.
To go along the terminology of being simple, like the surgeon can always override the robot. Is that fair? Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, like there's gain controls and things like that. So, you can slow down the robot's response if you're in a really, really tight situation. You're just like, I don't want the instrument to move as fast as it could potentially move in free space. I want the robot to slow me down. Sometimes that's actually what the surgeon wants. And so there's slider bars that they can jump to that just say, drop the top level of the gain down, and it's, that's something that they pick up during the training process, which is a very short process. In fact, we've got another big usability study coming up in a few weeks. And this round of surgeons, like the last time, they get about 2 hours worth of training for the user interface, and then they're in a cadaver doing work, and they seem to be picking it up really, really quickly. But yeah, it's important to, especially with something like a surgical robot, you need to make sure that there's enough. You want to keep things simple, but at the same time, you want to make sure that the power users or somebody who's had their hands on the robot for a few weeks and they start to go, I like the default, but I just want to have it feel a little bit, whatever in my hand. I want it to give me a little bit more resistance, or I want it to be a little bit looser. Let them make those changes, as long as you can do so obviously in a safe and efficacious manner, you know, depending on however your hardware works. But you know, those settings are important, but you know, you can't just like blast them in the face of the user either.
Got it. All right. So we've covered, who Galen Robotics is. We've covered, what data is critical, and it's clear, you need a market need, you need to test with end users, and to the extent that you have technical demonstration already out of the box with the technology or licensing, that certainly helps give you the confidence, and you transition into formal product development. And so the next section here is just kind of classic product development questions for you. So the first question, a lot of these startup companies that we talk with are, in the exploratory phase, like a phase zero. And at what point did you know that Galen was ready to go from phase zero to formal product development? I mean, because you're all, you're building this airplane as you're flying it. When did you lock, product requirements? What were you looking for?
You know, when we came back from that big otolaryngology conference, we clearly knew that we had some work to do on the requirements. Although I guess maybe the requirements themselves were relatively stable, but it was the engineering output response to those requirements that really needed to be changed. Um, but we knew we still had some work to do. I think when we had our Mark II prototype and we started putting it in front of people's you know, putting it in front of people again and doing, you know, phantoms and just different studies. Um, that was when the feedback was coming back, and it was like, oh, I love how this does this. And if you could support this, or if the force sensor was a little bit more durable, I could put this bigger instrument. Suddenly, the kind of feedback was come to us in the context of I believe in what you've done as a base model here. And so I'm now able to start thinking a little bit beyond what you've given me. And that's when we I would say anecdotally knew that we were ready to like start moving more aggressively into commercialization. Now, how do you quantify that? I mean, that's pretty tricky. You know, that comes down to the whole talking to customers and making sure that those requirements are really reflections of what is it the user wants to do. And that's important. You got to, and it takes, you know, we've done those. We do those. We've actually done requirement reviews company wide, where we've had almost every single person in the company sitting down as we would walk through one requirement after another, and actually even like sometimes hash out semantics, going, yeah, but is this requirement really describing what it is that we're trying to achieve? And you know that it takes more than one person in the room to do that sort of thing. So we made sure that you know everybody had at least visibility into that process. So it was tough. It was tough.
It sounds like there was a little bit of like a gut feeling that, you're onto something, and, you're ready to lock requirements, and you've got this combination of agreement from the market, plus now you have a team, and you sort of, sounds like you crowdsource reviewed your requirements. I think that's great. I mean, and, rather than just having the engineers, put requirements together and then just proceed with design control development, you get in this infinite loop of making design changes you have to document, and then you find, user needs come out of left field, and then you have to go back to phase zero. So I like how you at least focused on the end user and then crowdsourced, your requirements. So we're a pretty technical company here. I'm gonna ask a couple software related questions here. Dave, I remember on one of the other podcasts, you said that, surgical robots are close to 80% software anyways. So can you talk a little bit about the software and, what you licensed from Hopkins? And clearly, this is a public forum here. We don't need to get into the details of the control algorithms and things like that. But, other startup companies are inheriting SOUP, software of unknown pedigree, right? So how has the software evolved from when you first started to where we are today?
As nicely as I can say this, the software that was handed over to us from the university was for demo purposes only. There's no way that it was going to just roll straight into commercialization. it definitely demonstrated to us that things like the algorithms were understood. There's math, with kinematics and things like that can be really tricky. And so the software as it exists certainly provided proof that those algorithms had been sufficiently vetted. And so there were guts in there that were good. But, grad students and all of that working on different class projects and things like that, they're not having these big architecture meetings deciding how to like modularly produce software for a gizmo that's being developed inside of a university. So it was spaghetti. I mean,
Soup, spaghetti. Yeah.
and it was rough. And so we had the challenge of not only moving development forward, but also re-architecting it live. And so our director of software engineering, I think, did a just an incredible job. In fact, we've been able to add in some additional, future features for demo purposes that he was able to drop in within days because the code has become so much more robust and modularized. And that was critical. But, you know, my warning to anybody that is going to license code is, the code is going to show you that technologically it's feasible, but do not expect that you're just going to like slap some new icons on the code and then take it to market. It is not ready for that. And as good as you might hope it is, and you might interview some postgrad, seems like just the savant for coding or something like that. You just I think it's a bad idea to even assume that, oh my gosh, the code looks great. Well, no, it doesn't. You need to formally go through it on your side of the fence, and you need to treat it as a prototype, and you need to work it out and make it your own. Um, it's what you got to do.
Yeah, so it's a 6 degree of freedom robot, and then looking at the patents and whatnot, it's a series of transducers and sensors in an array, and you collect all this data, and it helps guide the user. But can you talk maybe philosophically on the control algorithm? Like, for example, how does the robot differentiate between, a hand tremor that's not intentional and an intended movement from the surgeon? Or does it just filter out, micro hand movement and
So it turns out from the literature that naturally occurring hand tremor actually has a very specific cycle to it. It's actually around 50 to 60 hertz. Um, Weirdly, as that number is, as a coincidence. But so certainly the first approach is really just filter out that jitter because you just don't need it, right? Yeah, I'm going to move from point A to point B. I don't need all this fuzz. So that turned out to actually be a relatively simple solution. But then, yeah, then it gets into the control algorithms gets way more complex from there because you still are asking, the kinematics to follow your hand and you want it to do it naturally, right? And so you don't want to feel the grind and pop from each of those individual motors as it's trying to decide to go into the next position as it's following, whatever vector or travel your hand is going through. So that's where it gets rough. And in fact, we have a person who's a PhD in hand controls. And that's all he does is just tuning the feel of moving the instrument along while you're holding it, so that it feels as natural. And I often use when it's not feeling good, especially in the early days, I describe it as crunchy. As you were actually trying to move the instrument, you could almost feel it almost felt like you were like dragging it across a gravel road. And that's, we could get into why that is, but that's, just that's a response factor of all the individual motors trying to like move into the next position kinematically as you're traveling along. And so getting that to feel natural was rough, and it's an ongoing process. Honestly, we'll always be tweaking and tuning that, based on different applications. The tuning might change depending on the procedure type. So the tuning is currently fine for our laryngeal indication, which is our first go to market. It might be different when you're doing neurosurgery. I don't know. So that's something we have to explore. But that's actually where it gets rough. Canceling out hand tremor turns out to actually be pretty easy.
So I'm just curious, when you get into V&V, there's the essential performance requirements, and I would imagine your essential performance is reduced hand tremor, aid surgeon positioning by X, either dimension or percent, whatever. I'm curious, are you developing a robot to test your robot, or are you using, how are you actually verifying that?
A lot of it is hand feel because if it doesn't feel good to the surgeon, it really doesn't matter what your numbers are. It still has to feel good because this is a cooperatively controlled robot. If it was fully autonomous, I could probably get away with something a little bit more automated. But in a lot of ways, we have to take it through the processes with a human being at the control stick because there is that qualitative factor. It's got to feel right, or it doesn't matter what the math says. So that was a challenge for us, and that doesn't necessarily apply to all surgical robots.
I'm going to ask a second part of that question as we enter the final round of our podcast here. We we used to call it
The
a lightning
lightning
round. I know
round.
I'm going to call it, questions from key techers. So to get on the market, medical devices need to be safe and effective. So you just described, a way to measure efficacy, right? It's got to feel right. But how do you justify safety when you have this tool on that's mounted on something that could very easily move very fast in a direction you don't want it to go? So kind of philosophically, how are you justifying the safety here?
That is part of your tuning, is that you have to understand what those bounds are for normal intended motions. Like a surgeon that is, got an instrument buried down into somebody's larynx isn't going to do this. It's never going to happen. And so you've got to find some way of characterizing what that unwanted motion would look like and make sure that you are basically restricting those motions within normal bounds for that procedure. So you do have to put numbers to things like that. But yeah, there's, another great example is when you're doing something like a mastoidectomy. You're drilling with an 80,000 RPM glorified Dremel tool, and the mastoid is not solid bone. It looks like an English muffin. There's like nooks and crannies all over the place. And one of the biggest risks that you have with a handheld drill is that you open up one of these nooks or crannies and your drill can actually like dive in. And inside of that little pocket could be one of two facial nerves. It could be a blood vessel. There's a lot of real dangerous stuff inside the mastoid just waiting for you to expose it. And so, understanding, and this isn't something that we currently do because we're not supporting a drill yet commercially. This is something that we're doing as research for this technology, but understanding what a normal drilling motion would look like versus the thing jerking out of your hand, that's something that you can actually, don't even need machine learning for that. That is something you can actually write an algorithm to and go where, if the surgeon says, turn on anti-jerk, don't let the tool jerk out of my hand. And that is a motion that you can characterize, and it's a motion that is unwanted, right? It is very easy to get any otologist to sit down and go, I don't want a tool jerking out of my hand. Okay, well, what does jerking out of your hand look like? Actually characterizing that mathematically and squelching that potential motion out from the robot's repertoire. That's where we add safety to manual instruments that cannot be achieved under normal means.
So yeah, it sounds like your first launch is implementing these safety features that don't exist with humans. So that's a great sort of baseline platform launch. And then, let's talk a little bit more about the future with autonomy. And you need to collect the data from each procedure eventually and use it. But what you have, the motion, I guess talk a little bit more about what data you're collecting or potentially going to collect with this product when it's on the market, and maybe an idea of what are the first couple layers of autonomy you'd want to go to market with.
I'll give you a hint. if you look at something that has been done by Dr. Greg Hager in the computer science department at Johns Hopkins, since 2006, he's been working on something called the language of surgery. And one of the examples of his research involves basically having a evaluation algorithm tied to the hand controls of a Da Vinci. And it can almost instantly tell you if how experienced the user is that has their hands in the control system. That can be applied all over the place. And so one of the things that we want to do is as we're collecting all the motion data from the surgeon that's driving the robot, is actually looking at the efficiency of hand motions and how can we help support what they ultimately want to do. Even without, even with like, tremor control and things like that, there's still going to be an inefficiency of motion. Are there ways that we can actually tighten that envelope and make the instrument do what we can tell the surgeon is really trying to do? And help them dial in the instruments so that they're just going straight for, the diseased tissue or whatever it is. And we can actually glean a lot of that from just the motion data. So that to me is really cool because that's fruit that can be done algorithmically because machine learning and surgical robots is not something that's going to go together in the foreseeable future because there is no clearance path with the FDA for basically having machine learning guide a robotic system that is holding a weapon, because that's really how they're looking at it right now, right? And so there's so much that we can do just by looking at the motion data and saying, how can we dial it in and really ultimately do what the surgeons are trying to do in the first place and actually be able to tighten that motion envelope. And so I think that's pretty exciting. But second to that is we have been exploring ways of adding, even though we're using existing surgical instruments, without modifying the instrument, how can we effectively add sensor data to the use of the instrument itself? Like, for example, if we were holding a drill with the robot, is there a way that we can actually tell how much pressure is being applied between patient tissue and the tip of the drill? And what kinds of things can we improve for the surgeon by that? Like, for example, can we make sure that if you're like in the middle ear and you're doing something called a stapedotomy, can I make sure that you can't push the drill so hard that you actually break the stapes or the stapes foot plate, which is a really bad thing to have happen? Or if I'm drilling those nooks and crannies I was talking about, and I've got pressure from the drill, and then suddenly I'm in outer space and there's no pressure, there's no resistance to the tip of the drill. Can I slow down the response of the drill just to make sure that it doesn't plunge? And these are all things that we can do with by adding maybe a little bit of additional sensor that might go into like the instrument adapter itself. So the instrument adapter might have additional sensors on it that just gives us better information about how the tool is being used and what kind of tissue response we're getting from the tool. And again, these are things that you cannot do in any meaningful way with a manually held instrument. So the cool thing about this whole industry is that robots are actually giving you access to information about how surgeries are being done that has been anecdotal for literally thousands of years. And now suddenly we can put numbers to hand motions. We can put numbers to, tissue contact and all those sorts of things. That even if you could have collected it, 10 years ago or something like that, it would have been useless because you're still holding the instrument manually. So what are you going to do, right? And so to us, that's really exciting because that also opens the door to what if we were talking to a nerve root monitor? Well, the way that currently works is you hear a beep and you stop your hand. Well, if we were talking directly to the nerve root monitor, we could get a signal from it and we could stop you in a way that the human hand cannot match. And so there's all kinds of safety capabilities that we could do just by being more connected in the OR. And to me, that's what I find really exciting because I'm not a roboticist. We've got expert roboticists here. That's not my thing. My thing is what kinds of applications can we provide using this robot as a platform? And that's really where we take this in the future. And that's cool to me. I love that stuff.
Yeah, I hadn't appreciated it right here until the end, where you keep talking about safety, and when you think about devices, they say safety and efficacy, but kind of the engineer in us always kind of jumps to, well, how effective is it? And you kind of downplay safety in a way. You just want to check that box, but your platform and surgical robotics in general sounds like safety almost could be more important, in what you're preventing than the efficacy.
Oh, heck yeah. One of Russ Taylor's famous phrases is the biggest risk of surgical robots is that it does exactly the right thing but in the wrong place. And we think of that all the time. In our code, it's baked in our DNA. Nine lines out of 10 in the software code are about double checking what you're about to do and in safety and all those sorts of things. And so, yeah, sometimes we almost take it for granted because it's such an integral part of everything that you tell the robot to do. You got to make sure that it's doing it safely. And that's got to be your baseline, and then build on top of that. But yeah, absolutely. The safety part and the opportunities for making surgery safer, although, man, that's a difficult indication to prove from a marketing clearance standpoint, but that's got to be your guiding light, I think, because that's where the opportunities really are.
Two more questions for you. This one's a little bit of a curveball, but I like this one. We polled the audience, or the key techers here. Are there certain actions, surgical actions, that a human is dramatically better than a robot at doing, as you see it now? Or are humans losing and they've already lost?
Well, I think one is where the robot I think is better is actually stabilizing instruments. I think a robot is better capable of holding something steady and never getting tired than a human being is. But here's the thing: human beings are better at getting the lay of the land. You can look inside, a part of the anatomy and you can figure out heads or tails as a human being way better than any algorithm is going to be able to do, at least in the foreseeable future. And so to me, that's why cooperative robotics is such a great opportunity, because you get to bring together the best of both worlds. Human beings are still the best motivated decision makers. They can look at something and they can motivate, they're motivated to go, okay, this is what I'm going to do. Okay, I've opened the patient up. Oh my God, they're a mess. And actually make a game plan and then apply it. But the robot can actually make it, to me, easier for them to do what they are trained to do. And that's the best of both worlds.
I totally agree. So, last question for you. So, you've been developing this robot for 6 years. You started as two guys in a garage, sounds like, and here you are today, thriving. So if you could go back and do one thing differently from a product development perspective, what do you think that would be, and why? And again, our audience is entrepreneurs at global companies, and folks like yourselves trying to get to market.
I wish I had more copies of our earlier prototypes. I feel like even with the Mark One and the flying trash can and all of that kind of stuff, I feel like we could have learned more if we had more copies of that robot that we could have. I've got 5 different universities that I work with on a regular basis that are using our platform or are building tools or software modules that are anticipating the use of our platform. And if I could just send them a robot to have, I think that would have been such a huge win. And it's tough because, especially in the money raising environment, unless you're willing to go to some $10 billion fund and bring in 100 million and get diluted beyond belief, it's not always easy to afford a half dozen prototypes of something that you're not sure if it's really the final version, right? But if I had a magic wand and I could make that decision without consequences being pollution, I would have absolutely have had more copies of each of our rounds of prototypes than what we actually ended up building. I just think it's more valuable. It's way more valuable.
It sounds like you wanted, why did you want more prototypes? Just more user feedback early?
More user feedback, and then sometimes maybe something screwy happens and you just like, oh man, if I could just like take this robot half apart, I could like learn so much and I could figure out, oh, why did it give that weird response, right? But if you've only got one or two of them, you take the thing apart so that you can play with it on the bench, you suddenly have taken that prototype out of commission. And now the software guys maybe don't have a platform to develop it on, or you can't take it over to the university, or you can't take it to a cadaver lab. You've got limited resources, right? There's only so many, especially with something like a surgical robot, you've only got so many resources, and yet you've got multiple, well, in our case, we had surgeons from, a half dozen disciplines going, I've got a cadaver, and if you can just bring the robot over, we'll do a cadaver lab with you. And it's like, oh my God. Yeah, just the opportunities create themselves if you've got multiple copies of your prototype.
Yeah. Did you consider like making an analog, a cheaper version? I'm thinking like, I don't want to say duct tape, but like, something that like kind of mimicked it enough to get you the user feedback that you were looking for? Or is it just way too complicated to even consider that? Or the other way to do it cheaply is do a subsystem.
It would have been tough in our case because the precision levels were actually creating new opportunities. There are minimally invasive and narrow corridor procedures where just no other robot could touch that thing. And the surgeons were like, well, I think your technology can, but I need to try it myself. And, it was kind of one of those tricky things where it's like what we were trying to evaluate really required a fully working platform. So we also did build simulators. So I mean, there are things that we did in fact do through software simulation. We actually simulated transsphenoidal approaches and things like that completely, incidentally, through Blender. We actually built an animation model with rigging in Blender, and we're actually able to validate things like a transsphenoidal approach and just make sure the geometry was sufficient to get in and out and all of that. So I mean, there certainly were things that we did do through software simulation. But yeah, I looking back, man, if I had extra versions of the Mark I and the Mark II, I would have been a happy camper.
Yeah. So there was obviously funding limitations, but I guess another question, if you could go back, yeah, I guess what was the most challenging part of what you're doing?
In some cases, it was actually taking some of those things that we were talking about earlier, those qualitative, kind of how does it feel, and actually turning that into numbers. I mean, at some point you're dealing with kinematics, right? You've got to turn it into math somehow, even though, like I said, it's got to feel right, or it doesn't matter what the math says. But the flip side of that is you've got to take what feels right and you've got to be able to express that as math. And that was tricky. We've got some hardcore math nerds here, and we had some scary whiteboards with with all kinds of crazy algorithms being worked out there. And that stuff can get really hairy at times. And sometimes we would almost, well, there were a couple times when we almost spent nothing but a full week just sitting there vetting math. Because ultimately that is where your safety comes from. I mean, if your algorithm's bad, especially for some of these weird kinematic equations, there could be a hidden motion that could actually cause an injury, and so that is rough to do. It is a hair pulling situation at times. Yeah.
Right. So you recommend like creating kind of a baseline algorithm and create this sort of embed it, through analytics.
Yeah, you gotta prove your math.
That'll be the next episode, Dave, sometime in the future. So hey, thank you so much for your time today, and obviously best of luck getting to market here in the next couple quarters or so, and go Baltimore. So thanks everybody.
Thanks for tuning in to MedTech Speed to Data, a KeyTech podcast. Join us each month for more ways to get the right data faster to inform critical decisions. Find additional resources on our website, keytechinc.com. If you like this episode, don't forget to subscribe, and please leave a review on iTunes whenever you listen. Thanks.